Hello, I'm Liz Lumley of Finextra, and today I'm speaking to Jamie Brighton of Adobe, and we're going to talk about forms, which of course every consumer knows is a fact of life. If you want to interact with a bank or an insurer, you're going to have to fill out a form. And increasingly those forms are becoming digital. So in light of this digital transformation, how mature is the industry in dealing with this environment?
I think it's fair to say not as mature as it could be. Certainly industry stats that we see indicate that up to 37% of processes within the financial services industry are actually still being driven by a paper-based approach. And the point that you make in the intro there about, as a consumer, we expect the form interactions that we have with an organisation to be optimised hasn't necessarily been picked up by the financial services industry.
So it's early days.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, since it's early days, I wanted to have a conversation about what customers are expecting, in terms of sort of product and maintenance, and how are banks and financial firms, responding to these expectations?
Yeah, well, I think that the fact that you might say that the industry isn't mature is not going to be allowed to carry on for very much longer. And we're seeing this across all aspects of digital marketing, where increasingly the customer dictates how the experience and what the experience should be with a brand, and that financial services organisations aren't exempt from that. So they expect an ease of use, they expect that the interface that they have on whatever digital touch point is going to be an easy one to use, it's going to adapt to their needs, and it's going to be relevant and engaging for them. And it might sound strange to talk about engaging, but even on a form process it needs to have all of the information that's relevant and pertinent to that individual available at at that sort of touch of the button. So I think financial services, just like every other organisation, every other industry and sector, is waking up to the fact that the form process is one of the main interaction points that it has with the customer, and that form process needs to be as streamlined as possible on both sides, really, on the consumer side but also within the bank. Employees within the bank need to have a centralised place for producing the form, producing the actual user experience, and also understand exactly where that data is going to be sent and captured and processed within the organisation.
So, acquiring customers online is always going to be cheaper than the sort of analog version. But saying that banks and insurers are under a lot of pressure for increased efficiency and cost savings. So, I mean, how are they really dealing with errors in digital forms, sort of not in good order incidents?
I think one point I would make is that financial services particularly is an area where it's increasingly expensive to actually acquire customers, even from a digital point of view. The way, paid search and all of those kind of ways of actually getting customers to a site in the first place, and starting the acquisition funnel, have always been very expensive for a lot of the key terms in financial services. So organisations should recognise that there always has been, and there will continue to be a pressure to make that money work as hard as possible. And again, trend-wise, what we're expecting and what we're seeing from digital marketers is that once they've paid that money to acquire someone and get them to one of their properties, whether it's on the mobile, on a traditional desktop site, they need to make sure that the processes are as streamlined as possible for that individual, so that they ultimately move from being a first-time visitor to a customer, hopefully, and then potentially a loyal customer. And one of the barriers to that in marketing terms is the idea of conversion rate optimization, and that's very applicable even with digital forms. A form is the central sort of point of getting that person to convert, getting them to become a customer, and you need to make sure that you're capturing all of the right information. And one way of kind of preventing not in good order forms is obviously to move them into the digital realm and to put all of the kind of validation and checks and balances in place to make sure that the data that you're getting from the customer is relevant. Some ways that you can do that obviously are to guide the customer through the process, letting them be aware of exactly what type of data you're expecting at each point in the process. And also increasingly using things like third-party data providers and potentially as well information from within the organisation. If your form processes can have access to data that you're holding about the customer, and data that you can bring in from social sites like Facebook, obviously with the customer's consent, then using that data to pre-populate the form is going to make sure that you're getting a much higher percentage of forms that are actually in good order.
So it's that balance between getting all the data you need and making the process as simple for the customer as possible.
Absolutely, yeah.